Hi, my name is Andy Jaski, and welcome to Music Between the Numbers. I'm a musician and economist, and in this set of videos, I'm taking a look at how popular music has changed in measurable ways over time. In episode 4, we'll take a look at a variety of Spotify audio features, and we're looking at the period 1955 through 2020 and the top 10 songs from Billboard for each year. So let's get to the data. As a review, in the first 3 episodes, we saw how the number of chords per song, danceability, energy, loudness, and speechiness have changed over time. The number of chords per song has declined while each of the other elements have generally increased through time. This week, we'll take a look at a variety of new measures: acousticness, liveness, instrumentalness, mode, and valence. Let's look at the Spotify definitions for each of these. Acousticness tells us how acoustic the sounds and the instruments are in the track. For example, I have a song called Forevermore, which is mostly acoustic guitar, vocals, and snaps, and it gets an acousticness value of 0.865. That's very high, and it seems about right. Liveness is simply trying to measure whether or not it is a live performance. Instrumentalness is just that. Is the song an instrumental, or does it have vocals? Mode is a measure of whether the song is in a major or minor key. Now, some songs could have both, but Spotify's algorithm makes a call and classifies it as either one or the other, so it takes on a value of 1 for major and 0 for minor. Major keys tend to be associated with a little happier sound in the music, and minor keys tend to be more associated with a sadder sound in the music. That brings us to our next measure, which is called valence, which is a fancy word for the mood of the music. We might expect this to be associated with a major or minor key, but it also takes into account other aspects of the song that create a mood. I also pulled in data on tempo, but it is really a bit hard to digest. It isn't clear Spotify gets that correct all of the time, as it seems to sometimes think slow songs are very fast. But if we aggregate data, we might get rid of a little of the noise, though, so it's worth a quick review, and I'll share a graph on that as well. So let's look at acousticness now, and we see in the top 10 of our acousticness measure, it's dominated by older songs. Bruno Mars has a song in there that is all acoustic piano and vocals, so the list makes some sense in what shows up there. The bottom 10 seem about right too, although it's a bit quirkier. It's notable that there are 58 songs with a value less than 0.01 on this measure, so there's quite a bit of music that just doesn't have a very acoustic sound to it. So in terms of changes, this dropped dramatically each decade from the 1950s to the 1980s. Then it leveled off from the 80s to the 90s and dropped even a little more post-2000. So here is another feature that has had a pretty dramatic shift throughout time. The next characteristic is liveness, and here we get some odd results when looking at the top 10. The Streak comes in at number 1, but it's a song that just has a laugh track, not a real audience. The Robbie Nevil song has some group talking in the middle, and Hound Dog probably shows up on the list because it has live clapping that is a bit offbeat as part of its recording. I guess the real insight here is that there aren't really any live performances that make it to the top 10 songs. Notably, our friend Gwen Stefani and Hollaback Girl get the least liveness. I think that lack of liveness may go along with danceability. It's kind of a odd outcome. Now, examining our graph through time, there's really not much of a trend. Maybe slightly more liveness component to songs in the 50s and 60s, but that's about it. So here's a metric that really hasn't changed much in the period since 1955. Basically, it just says most hit songs are made in a studio. So let's move to the top 10 for instrumentalness. And we see that it's exclusively older music with only one song in 1991 and the rest in 1976 or prior. Instrumentals just don't make it big anymore, which isn't to say that people don't listen to instrumental music, but it has a hard time becoming hit music and probably is divvied up amongst a wide variety of mood music. Note that about 45% of the database scores 0 on this dimension, so we really don't have a bottom 10. Over time, we see that in the late 1950s, there were a substantial number of hit instrumentals, but that dropped off to few by the 1970s and almost nothing today. So let's move next to the mood-related measures, mode and valence. Since mode is just 0 for minor and 1 for major, it doesn't make any sense to do a top or bottom 10. Here we see that major keys dominated in the 1950s and even 1960s, but since then, there are more popular songs in minor keys, with the 2000 to 2009 time period being the lowest in terms of major keys at 57%, with 43% being in a minor key. Since this is a 0 or 1 variable, you can read the chart in that way. So turning to valence, which is the mood of a song, we actually see there's a slight negative correlation between mode and valence. So that seems a little bit weird from the Spotify description of valence. So let's take a look at the top 10 and bottom 10 for valence. Here we do see that more upbeat songs are on the top 10 list, but it's kind of a mixed group and it tends to be weighted toward older songs. It certainly strikes me that lyrical content is not a consideration, which we knew it wasn't, but this verifies it. The songs in the bottom 10 are really just more mellow, ballad-like songs than the top 10. When I think about a happy mood, I Believe I Can Fly might be seen as a very uplifting song, right up there with Joy to the World, but it's a lot more mellow, obviously. So I would say valence at times might be more of a proxy for what I would think of as mellow or ballad-like songs than it is for happy versus sad. So how does the valence measure look over time? Well, it's basically flat through the 1980s and then drops way off in the 1990s. Remember, that was our ballad decade, and then creeps back up a bit after that. But it's pretty bifurcated in terms of its distribution, with before 1990 being the happier song period and after 1990 being the sadder or more mellow song period. It's a bit of an odd outcome and suggests that valence is a bit more complex measure in the way Spotify has it defined, and that we might really need to dig into more deeply to understand exactly what it's telling us. Remember, though, that part of the Spotify definition for valence is that if it's low, it might represent things being depressed or angry. So when we look at these aggregated numbers by decade, perhaps those are the moods it is attempting to measure, as well as sad or happy. My take is that this is the least objective of all the measures, and trying to read too much into it is probably not a wise thing. However, we can see that since 1990, music has become some combination of more sad, depressed, angry, or just mellow than it was in prior decades. Honestly, if I ran Spotify, I might want to redo this measure based on this analysis. Finally, let's look at tempo. And here we see there's really not much change in the average tempo through time. Maybe a very slight upward trend, but these differences are not substantial. About all one might say is that music in the last decade is a bit faster on average than music in the late 1950s, but that's not too much of an insight. So let's summarize what we learned today from the characteristics that we examined. We saw that acousticness has dropped dramatically through the decades. We saw instrumentalness, whether or not a song is an instrumental or not, drop off from the 1950s to the 1960s to the 1970s and has gone even lower through time. There really are very few or no instrumental hits anymore. Liveness has been pretty steady through time. Most hit songs are recorded in a studio, and the songs that are identified as having a high liveness may simply have other features on them that emulate this, something like a laugh track. In the 1950s and 60s, there were more songs in major keys, but since the 1970s, the mix between major and minor key songs has flattened out. Valence, or mood, has a bifurcated distribution, with happier sounding songs being more dominant before 1990 than they are after 1990. And finally, the average tempo of songs has not really changed all that much unless one compares the most extreme tales of our time distribution, songs in the late 1950s, and the most recent decade. So that summarizes things for today. In the fifth and final episode for the near term, I'll be taking a look at the duration of songs and then take the data that we've looked at, all the different metrics, and apply them to my own music and as well as that of some other artists that might be a little better known than myself. And I think we'll have a very nice profile at that point of just how music has changed in measurable ways and to some extent how it hasn't changed on a few metrics from the period 1955 to 2020. Thanks again for watching. This is Andy Jaski wishing you happy listening. Bye-bye.